Año 1500.
The year is 1516. A distinguished figure, well known amongst his contemporaries, has decided to emigrate to a new country at the age of 64. The journey, in the heart of winter, will be long. Our traveler will leave Milan in the region of Lombardy and push forward through the Piedmont region to the west. Crossing the same high alpine peaks, those same bare rocks that he drew so many times when he chose them as the ideal landscapes for the paintings he created. This period map shows the different places that our traveler and his party passed through as they made their way westward to France. Just before reaching the Loire, the group came across a forest and stopped for a moment. By now, they were close to their destination. They weren't stopping just to rest. The old gentleman wanted to touch, for the very first time, the flowers of the country where he would spend the last years of his life. This man was Leonardo da Vinci. This is the font where Leonardo was baptized. The document, signed by his grandfather, Antonio, remains intact. He wrote, "My grandson, son of my son Ser Piero, was born on the 15th of April, Saturday, at 3 in the morning. Baptized by Father Piero de Bartolomeo of the village of Vinci, the child was given the name Leonardo." What follows is a list of all those present. It is fascinating to note that this document does not include the name of Leonardo's mother, Caterina. 1 year after the baptism, in 1453, Caterina and Antonio di Piero dei Buti del Vaca, known as Acatabriga, were married by the same Father Piero, because Leonardo's father married another woman. From this point on, it would seem that Caterina disappeared from Leonardo's life, but we know that he was baptized here. Here in this village called Anchiano, not far from Vinci, there were many houses just like this one in Leonardo's time, simple houses where people from Vinci, including Leonardo's grandparents and father, lived temporarily. They were mostly farmers and notaries. This same house, bought by Leonardo's father in 1482, when Leonardo left Florence and moved to Milan, in this same house that his grandfather had almost certainly rented previously, which is why his father ultimately bought it, this is where Leonardo spent his childhood, here. What did he remember of this home, this childhood? What did he remember? Well, Leonardo's bedroom was the one at the far end of the house, and he shared it with his uncle Francesco. His grandparents, Lucia and Antonio, occupied the other bedroom. And this was the dining room and kitchen area. Leonardo's memory, which he left behind in his Atlantic Codex, was this. My earliest childhood memory is one in which I seemed to be lying in a cradle. Suddenly, a kite appeared before me, and with its tail feathers, it opened my mouth and fluttered its tail against my lips. This is written in the Atlantic Codex. Is this the memory of something that actually happened? Or perhaps it was a dream. Sometimes we confuse dreams with reality. Leonardo would go on to become a great observer of birds in flight. He was, in fact, the first genius who dared to believe that man, too, would one day fly as birds do. So this memory did leave its mark on him. Perhaps he felt that this bird, so insistent about peering into his face like that, was trying to tell him something important. Did it really happen? We don't know. Of Leonardo's childhood in this house, this is the only memory we know of. Through this window in one of the bedrooms, we can look out onto the forests of Anchiano, deep, thick forests. As a child, Leonardo would explore these forests with his uncle Francesco. He didn't just look at the trees as a big clump. He would examine all the little details of this forest, the leaves on the trees, the flowering plants, the ground cover. It was here that he first became fascinated with nature. And it was nature that, in the end, was the great teacher and guiding force of his life. Now, how did young Leonardo explore nature between the ages of 6 and 16 or 17? How did he come to understand the natural world? Well, he didn't just look at it. We all look and think we see things. When we read his writing and study his drawings, something begins to become clear. Leonardo believed that in order to see, it is not enough just to look. You must touch. Whatever it is, you must gaze at it for a very long time, and once you've understood it with your eyes, you must verify its contours with your fingers. One year after giving birth to Leonardo, Caterina married a baker by the name of Accatabri. She was separated from her son very quickly. With humility, she performed her daily domestic chores, enduring in silence and solitude the sorrow of being separated from her son. Right now, I'm at the Museo Ideale Leonardo da Vinci in the village of Vinci. With me is Professor Alessandro Vezzosi, the sole creator of this wonderful museum. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask him some very important questions. Alessandro, it's a pleasure to see you again. Among the different books you have published, there are some amazing findings. For example, it appears that the discovery of Leonardo's fingerprints on some manuscripts has led to the conclusion that his mother was not entirely Italian. What can you tell us about this? Well, firstly, I should clarify a few things to avoid any confusion or misunderstanding. Several years ago, on a project that goes back to 1978, I became fascinated by fingerprint marks, in particular those of Leonardo. My starting point was a very simple concept. Leonardo used sfumato technique in his paintings. He did not only do it with his brush, he also did it with his fingerprints. In addition, he worked all day with his notebooks, taking notes while he was traveling or eating in all kinds of daily activities. Because his fingers were always dirty, he would often leave marks or blot the ink stains on the paper. I found many of these stains on his manuscripts, which I then connected to the fingerprints on his paintings. I did this research while I was writing Leonardo's biography, And various pieces of evidence led me to the conclusion that there was no evidence to prove that Leonardo's mother was a peasant or a servant from Vinci. In fact, everything seems to suggest something else, that she was a slave, probably from the Middle East. I cannot be sure if she was Arab, Hebrew, or Circassian, because the document, the contract of acquisition, has never been found. This is because during those years, in 1452, when Leonardo was born, we do not know of any law in the Signoria of Florence governing the presence of the many slaves from the Middle East in Tuscany. By now we have seen how the young Leonardo, starting at the age of 6, explored the world of nature, not just looking at it, but touching it, using his eyes and his fingers. This, of course, prompts another question. When and how did he start to draw? It happened quite naturally. Leonardo was always with his grandfather, possibly every day. When Don Antonio recorded his accounts, he was a farmer and a trader. What did he use? Ink, a quill, and paper. Our young friend discovered these tools. Now, when we think of all those shapes and forms that he had come across, all the things he had gazed at, touched, and committed to memory, surely it seems natural that he would want to take his grandfather's quill, ink, and paper, without permission, of course, and use them to describe what he had observed. He did this, however, not with words, but by copying them, by reproducing those shapes and forms. This is how he began to draw, and he would recall this many times in the years to come. Sometimes as he walked along the banks of the river Arno, bad weather would catch Leonardo by surprise. But he enjoyed the rain and thunder and would seek cover under a bridge where he could continue to draw and write. 30 years later, he would return to the same bridge to include it in a very famous painting. In 1469, when Leonardo turned 16 or 17, his father Piero decided to take him to Florence. And so the young man left Vinci, walking alone down the roads less traveled. He said goodbye to many things: the Guidi Castle, the Tower of San Croce. Would he ever see them again? Before leaving Vinci, Leonardo's father Piero had explained to him that Florence was the most influential cultural center in all of Europe, but that there were many other important cities in Italy as well. Venice, Milan, Mantua, Urbino, Rome, and Naples.
Y reconociendo,
Ser Piero, recognizing his son's very clear artistic vocation, also told him about the powerful families and religious orders that protected the architects, sculptors, and painters that migrated to this great city. He mentioned many of these artists by name: Cimabue, Giotto, Fra Angelico, Masaccio, Ghirlandaio, Lippi, Gozzoli, della Robbia, Donatello, Verrocchio, and the greatest of them all, Brunelleschi. But first, Ser Piero showed Leonardo the city. Imagine what it must have been like for this young man from the countryside, from Anchiano, tiny village of Vinci, to see the cathedral for the first time, Giotto's campanile, the baptistry with its incredible mosaics, the Palazzo Vecchio. Just imagine that. These mosaics, which date back to the 13th century, represent the Christian mysteries. From God the Creator, accompanied by choirs of angels, to scenes from the New Testament. The background behind all these figures is done entirely in gold. But Leonardo probably missed the blue skies he loved so much. Leonardo's father made a very special point of taking his son to the hospital, which for many years had received and cared for abandoned children. It was called, understandably, the Hospital of the Innocents, and had been built 50 years earlier by Filippo Brunelleschi. Leonardo, however, did not react with astonishment because his one true home was, and always would be, nature. His father, Ser Piero, wanted to give his son an education. Despite being declared illegitimate, Leonardo was still at that point Piero's only child, since his first two wives had been unable to bear children. Perhaps he had harbored the illusion that Leonardo would become a lawyer or a notary like himself. But he also knew that his son already excelled at drawing. And this was what convinced him to place Leonardo in the workshop of a master artist. He wanted a good master, of course, and of the many that were working in Florence at the time, he settled on Andrea di Cioni, otherwise known as Verrocchio. Leonardo closely studied the sculptures that his master was working on. Some of them, as we will see, would become etched in the young man's memory, and their influence would eventually emerge in his future paintings. Ser Piero showed Leonardo's drawings to Verrocchio. The great artist was impressed. He probably met with Leonardo, gave him some kind of test, and confirmed that the drawings he had been shown were indeed the work of this young man. And so began Leonardo's new life as an artist's apprentice.
El muchacho se fijó en las pequeñas esculturas.
The young man took notice of the tiny sculptures, all different, affixed to the base of the cathedral tower.
Estas pequeñas esculturas
These tiny sculptures
eran elementos
were
decorativos
decorative elements that architects included on the facades of the structures they built.
¿Por qué son importantes?
Why are they relevant at all?
Por los temas que
Because they represent important themes.
la primera
From the first one, by the Pisanos, to the last one, by Luca della Robbia,
ilustran la vocación,
these decorative elements represent the human vocations.
el arte,
The arts, of course, including painting, sculpture, and architecture,
la geometría.
but also philosophy,
Entonces,
grammar,
como
and
todas
geometry.
ellas fueron realizadas al
Some of these sculptures were made shortly before Leonardo arrived in Florence,
cuando él ya estaba,
while others were created while he was living there.
las contempló.
He must have gazed at them and felt lured by many of these different vocations. And I wondered,
¿Sabe? Yo estoy seguro que sí.
I wondered,
¿Quién sabe sintió
did he see himself experimenting with all of them,
capacidad
all at the same
de
time?
experimentarlas
I'm
todas?
sure that he did.
Antes de partir a Florencia, Leonardo
Before Leonardo left for Florence,
tío Francesco
his uncle Francesco and his grandfather Antonio
que el
had
gobierno
explained to him that the city government
estaba en manos
was run by a family
de
of bankers,
banqueros, los Medici.
the Medici.
El escudo de la
Their coat of arms
contenía esas esferas,
was comprised of several balls
símbolo del dinero,
symbolizing
es
money,
decir, el símbolo del gremio
which of course is the emblem
prestamista.
of the lending and banking trade.
Leonardo
Leonardo first laid eyes on the Medicis when he saw their portraits hanging in the chapel of the family palace.
el artista Benozzo
All of them were done by Benozzo Gozzoli,
por Cosmede
whose work Cosimo de' Medici admired very much.
no representan
This painting doesn't represent the journey of the Magi,
sino
but a number of historical delegations.
¿en qué sentido
In what way do these paintings
pueden referirse?
have anything to do with Leonardo da Vinci?
Para mí hay dos
I
significados
believe they influenced his thoughts and life in two ways.
con el pensamiento y la vida de Leonardo. Primero,
Firstly,
todos estos personajes reales,
all the royal characters depicted here
en el sentido de la magnificencia,
are magnificent in the sense that they are physically and richly magnificent. They are all very well dressed.
bien, hay una gran variedad,
We see a luxuriant array of marvelous garments
hay muchos elementos.
and many decorative trimmings.
Esta magnificencia
This kind of a
era
magnificence
buscada en Florencia en el tiempo de
was very sought after in the Florence of Leonardo's age.
son aquellos que participaron en el
And
mundo,
many of the people depicted here took part in the movement known as Humanism.
personas que habían conocido
These people who had studied the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome, memorizing and reciting ancient texts, believed themselves to be very wise. Leonardo, observing this magnificence, observing these royal characters, had something to say. He wrote, "I am quite aware that since I am not a learned man, certain arrogant individuals will find it reasonable to criticize me by calling me illiterate. Yet they are the ones who are really ignorant. They are always inflated, pompous, well-dressed, and bejeweled. They are adorned not by their own labors, but by the work of others, and they refuse to grant me the benefit of my own worth. But if they scorn me, an inventor, they give me all the more reason to criticize them, for they are not inventors. They merely divulge and recite the works of others." Benozzo Gozzoli, innocently and without secret motives, depicted the subjects of his paintings as very elegant, self-assured people, because that was what Cosimo de' Medici, who had commissioned the work, wanted. This, however, represented a realm of humanity to which Leonardo did not belong, and he set himself apart from this Florentine society. They, in turn, viewed him as an ignorant loner who had no interest in classical culture, the knowledge of which conferred social prestige and status. The second point. Leonardo rejected the kind of painting that was full of tiny details. All those paintings that presented a profusion of shapes and colors, all perfectly defined, in which the artist applied the same degree of definition to all the elements, from the most distant horizon to the tiniest leaf, bird, or flower in the foreground. Now, Leonardo did believe that we ought to learn from nature, from atmosphere. This, for him, meant learning to distinguish what is distant from what is close up. Atmosphere. He despised the kind of detailed drawings that define things too much. And also, we must remember that Leonardo venerated Masaccio, as we shall see further on, for a reason. Masaccio was economical. He didn't put so many things. Benozzo Gozzoli here put so many things, an infinite number of shapes, of colors. It's almost as if he were afraid of empty spaces. In Latin, there is a term for this, horror vacui, which means fear of the empty space. Leonardo was not afraid of empty space, so he placed only certain things, certain parts, certain details of the reality he saw. Now, of course, we admire Benozzo Gozzoli's very decorative approach, this illustrative impulse that Cosimo the Elder admired so much. I am walking alone in this beautiful place like an idle man. Is idleness something we should frown upon? According to Leonardo, no. Leonardo often wandered idly through the streets of Florence and Milan, and as a teenager in Vinci too. What did he write about this idleness of his? Let me read you something from his Atlantic Codex. When you wander around idly, you will usually see a number of different places, and you will notice people's gestures as they are discussing something, laughing or arguing. Write all this down quickly. How? He goes on to tell us that we should do this in a small notebook, that you should keep with you at all times, because it would be impossible to recall all the shapes and actions that you see and may want to use in your future artwork. And so, of course, he would carry these little notebooks around everywhere, constantly opening them to jot down words and drawings. And many people would say to him, "What a mess, all those books full of notes." And he would respond, "Just a moment. This is a collection of many disorganized notes that are waiting to be organized later, by theme." This is how we must try to understand Leonardo's codices. On every page, we find all kinds of drawings of animals, anatomy, landscapes, notes about machines. These are the famous codices, the notebooks that he carried with him always. This is the church of Santa Maria del Carmine. I'm going inside to see the frescoes in the Brancacci chapel, painted by Masaccio. Leonardo admired them. Why? Because of the absence of superfluous decorative details. For Masaccio, all that mattered was to make his subjects come alive with gestures that expressed their feelings. And what did Leonardo write about Masaccio? The painter will find that his work is of little value if he uses the paintings of others as a model. But if he finds inspiration in nature, he will take good advantage, just as we have seen, of the great painters that came after the Romans, who imitated one another so much that their art eventually fell into decline. After these painters came Giotto of Florence, born in Monte Solitario, a place inhabited only by goats and other animals. He found inspiration in nature and used it as a model for his art, and began to draw all the animals that he found in the region where he lived. After a great deal of hard work and observation, he surpassed not only the masters of his own age, but those of previous times as well. After Giotto, art began to decline once again, because everyone imitated his painting. It declined from one century to the next, until Tommaso of Florence, better known as Masaccio, showed us with his perfect works of art that those who did not model their work on nature, master of all masters, were working in vain. By the time Leonardo turned 20, he was mature in the art of painting, and his name was duly inscribed in the Red Book of the Guild of St. Luke, the organization that represented the artists of Florence. From that point on, he planned out his life according to two parallel activities. The most important one? To investigate freely and systematically the forms and phenomena of nature, and then to create works of art and inventions by applying what he learned from nature.